Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Criminal investigators in the military face some of the toughest criminal cases in federal service. But a new GAO report finds that the agencies responsible for training them aren't consistently tracking who's completed what. Without clear oversight and program-wide evaluation, agencies may be sending investigators into the field without the full preparation they need, and that puts criminal trials and public trust at risk. Here to fill us in on GAO's findings and recommendations is Director in GAO's Defense Capabilities and Management Team, Christy Williams. Ms. Williams, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. It's good to be here.
GAO just released a new report looking at the training programs for military criminal investigators. This is a really interesting spin on things. Why did you pick this group? What motivated this assessment?
So the importance of this topic is really because the proper handling of criminal investigations of serious and complex crimes or felonies. So think things like homicide, sexual assault, anything that involves military personnel or civilian personnel that might be located on facilities that fall under the responsibility of one of the armed forces. That investigation is critical not just to maintaining safety and security for the military force, but also it could impact military readiness. So criminal investigators at the military criminal investigative organizations, so think things like NCIS, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, those investigators are responsible for handling these incidents. So back in 2020, an independent committee, this was at the time established by the Army in response to the disappearance and murder of a soldier at Fort Hood, identified some deficiencies in criminal investigators' experience and their training to really be able to handle these complex cases and accomplish their missions. So we looked at that training, we looked at how it's tracked, we looked at whether the effectiveness is evaluated, and really just the oversight of the training.
Well, I imagine that real life isn't like an NCIS TV show. It doesn't flow as smoothly, and the investigators may have, different levels of training. Is that what you found?
Absolutely. So when you look at training for the training curriculum for a criminal investigator, you can kind of look at it as a progression. So everybody will start with some standard initial training. This takes place at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, often referred to as FLETC. This is basic criminal investigation training for most of the federal government. So it provides the military criminal investigators with about a 13-week course on the basic knowledge and skills needed for federal criminal investigations. From there, it kind of varies depending on your service. There is some service-specific basic training that is provided by each military service. It does vary, and it's really focused on the coursework of the respective criminal investigative organization and its operating context. So this can be things like, crime and death scene management, military law, but it's going to vary by service. Then you fast forward to some on-the-job training. This is really an approach to apply classroom learning to the daily work. This can be things like rules of evidence, search and seizure, and again, these can vary by service. And lastly, some of the MCIOs, the criminal investigative organizations, have some advanced courses that they offer. However, these can be based on an individual field office's needs or potentially on the criminal investigator themselves, their interest or their professional goals. This can vary, and they're not always consistently provided across the organization.
And this matters because the investigators are creating a good portion of the evidence that would be presented at a trial, correct?
They are responsible. The military criminal investigative organizations themselves really are the federal law enforcement agency with jurisdiction within their respective military service. So those investigators are conducting federal level criminal investigations for any of these serious and complex crimes that might come up.
And did you find variation across the services in the conduct of the training and the tracking?
So we did find some differences both in the tracking and the evaluation of the effectiveness. So from a tracking perspective, beyond the initial training, the military criminal investigative organizations, they track some of the service-specific advanced training, but they might not have full information on training completed outside of that initial course at FLETC or some of their academy-focused courses. So this means training certification can be dependent on whether that investigator provides proof of completing the training in a timely manner And in some cases, if the local training coordinator certifies the information in a timely manner. There can be challenges as well because some of the services don't have currently a central repository for tracking the completion of information. So both the Army Criminal Investigative Division and the Air Force Office of Special Investigations are in the process of developing a single system or a service-wide system to track that training completion. So that also is, you see some differences in the tracking of the system perspective among the services. So what you ultimately get is some of that service-specific or advanced training that is only recorded or provided if there's a request for information or if the field or unit leader, for example, manually goes in and enters the information. And that's really what we found, driven by a lack of guidance on having a requirement to track that training completion.
I'm speaking with Christy Williams. She's a director in GAO's Defense Capabilities and Management Team. Let's follow that thread then. It matters that people trust that these investigators are well trained, that they've passed their training, that they are qualified to do the work. You made several recommendations as a result of this investigation. What did you suggest?
We did. So we made 9 total recommendations. 7 went to the Department of Defense and 2 went to the Department of Homeland Security, just given the involvement of the Coast Guard Investigative Service in this work. We had recommendations focused on both the training and the inconsistencies with which they evaluate the effectiveness of training. So that effectiveness might be evaluated for certain courses, but program-wide there was no consistent evaluation of whether the training was meeting the needs to really be able to fulfill this investigative mission. So we had a couple of recommendations focused on just developing and issuing that guidance, or in some cases, updating existing guidance to make sure things like requirements and procedures to track training existed. And then making sure that there were plans for a regular program-wide evaluation of criminal investigative training, having things like timeframes and measures of effectiveness to really document those results. And for those recommendations, that there was agreement and I think recognition that additional effort in these areas could be beneficial to ensuring consistency in that mission. So that includes kind of evaluation and tracking, not so much the oversight piece, which was slightly separate in our effort.
What you're really suggesting is a system that tracks and reports how well criminal investigators are doing in their career field. Have they completed different things and sort of credentialing along the way? Is that correct?
Yeah, fundamentally just making sure there is a requirement that training is tracked and then having a plan to evaluate the training to make sure it is meeting the intended need and really fulfilling that mission.
But not a question at this point of the sufficiency of the training itself.
So one of the things that we didn't do was go into an evaluation of the quality or the sufficiency of the individual training. The report does outline some of the courses that are offered, some of the progression, as I mentioned, of the training that goes through. So it wasn't as much focused on necessarily whether those courses met the intent. It was whether there was a requirement to track the training and whether there was a requirement to make sure that training was meeting the intended need.
And how have DOD and DHS, and in this case also since Congress requested it, members of Congress responded to the report?
It was a recognition from the departments, both Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security, that, these recommendations were valid and there was concurrence with the recommendations. And both agencies identified steps that they would take to update their guidance and to make sure the evaluation procedures were in place for the training, broadly speaking. I will note from a Department of Defense perspective, one of the challenges that we identified was with oversight and making sure there are clear roles and responsibilities for who should be doing this, because statutorily, the Department of Defense Inspector General is responsible for the criminal investigative program. But in 2023, so a couple of years ago, the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security was also assigned some roles specific to law enforcement. So the department recognized clearly establishing these roles would really provide some help in terms of making sure that the training was looked after in the proper manner.
That makes sense. And this is obviously not something you can just snap your fingers and have ready tomorrow. What's a reasonable time frame for DHS and DOD to be online with this kind of tracking and moderation system?
So timeframes are tricky, and it's one of the things we don't always like to prescribe because there are other underlying issues that we recognize the departments and the services are working through. I think fundamentally, it's important from an oversight perspective to clarify what those roles and responsibilities are within the Department of Defense. You need to have that clearly defined before you can really make sure you've established that policy and fully implemented it. From our perspective, we follow up on these recommendations on an annual basis, sometimes more often. So we're hopeful that with the department's agreement, both of the departments' agreement that these recommendations would be beneficial, that we see some action in the near term.
I've been speaking with Christy Williams. She's the director in GAO's Defense Capabilities and Management Team. Thanks so much for sharing this report with us.
Thank you for having me.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
What makes a great leader in government? Christine Harada joins WEPA CEO Shane Canfield to reflect on her journey from aerospace engineering to the White House. In this episode, she shares lessons on public-private collaboration, leading with purpose, and why service, not power, should guide leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Christine Harada, former Senior Advisor at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Harada, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You spent portions of your career working in both the public and the private sector. And from your experience, what makes leadership in the federal sector different than the private sector?
At the highest level, leadership in the public sector is very fundamentally at its core mission-driven. Right? The work is in the service of the public good, and the goals and the programs are frequently long-term, they're systemic, and they're incredibly complex. And success, isn't necessarily measured by quarterly earnings. We don't have that kind of drumbeat, but certainly more by the lasting impact that we have on Americans' lives. What's also unique about public sector is, in my view, the profound sense of history that you feel. And I think certainly I was very aware about the work that I was doing and how it builds on the efforts of those who came before me, and that future generations of leaders also depend on the decisions that were being made today. And that, for me, certainly provided a greater weight of responsibility.
That's a wonderful answer. And I was in the private sector for much of my career, and now WEPA is a nonprofit, and I really relate to what you said about being mission-driven rather than profit-driven. You've got a long-term view, and always at the core of it is serving others.
Yes.
Is there a moment that stands out to you from early in your career that influenced your leadership style later on?
I started out my career as an aerospace engineer, building satellites and airplanes. And when I first entered the workforce, my organization at the time had 120 people. We were a large company, 120 people, 4 women, and I was the only woman of color. I was also the youngest throughout the entire organization. And so, I remember having an experience when I was doing some engineering work. We had a design review, and I had seen some issues with the flight software that I pointed out. At the time, they're like, maybe it's not really that big of a concern. I was like, but in my heart, I knew that the issue was real and stayed with it. And sure enough, a few weeks later, that topic came up again, and we addressed it. Turns out my concern did indeed prove to be valid. And so it's just one of those experiences that really sank into me around ensuring that I am listening to everybody, period, end of story, within the organization. Really thinking through about how do we take into consideration opinions from all different spectra. As a third-generation Japanese American, right, I was raised to be humble, keep your head down, and work hard, etc. But at times, leadership also requires you to speak up, do so politely, with courage, etc. Even though you may be the only voice in your room, but certainly trust your voice. It also really helped shape my belief around diversity. DEI programs right now are viewed in a negative light. We're all mosaics, and they become better because you have those different experiences. And that's really stayed with me throughout the entirety of my career.
The diversity issue is a really big one coming from the insurance industry. That's an industry which is working on that. it's really a diversity of viewpoint and perspective and experiences that does influence your business, and more diverse employee bases absolutely helps. Was there a time in your federal career, perhaps when you were at OMB, that you faced what you consider a real challenge, and how did you overcome it?
One moment that really stands out in particular was when I was serving as the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer during the Obama administration. We had set, like many administrations, had set some really ambitious goals, very, very, very ambitious goals around how do we think about making the federal government's operations much more sustainable. But the challenge wasn't so much about the scale or the technical capacity of the organization. A lot of it was really centered around the funding. We overcame this largely by being very strategic, helping out with blocking and tackling with the variety of legal issues or legal questions that might have come up, like how do we address this? Certainly in the federal government, you're more often leading through influence as opposed to pure form authority, and that you really need to listen deeply, communicate clearly with folks, building out those coalitions and engaging with your stakeholders. And I know many folks in government speak like that, but that is the truth.
As someone who's spent time in both the federal and the private sectors, what makes the relationship between the two sectors important?
Certainly, it's an absolutely essential partnership, and I would add on to that, like nonprofits or philanthropic organizations. As I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, and in Japan there's a symbol for thunder, which looks like 3 arrows pointing around each other in a circular pattern, kind of to represent the swirl, if you will, of clouds. And that's kind of how I view the relationship between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. The government frequently sets the vision, the policy, the direction, but of course it's the private sector that brings the capital, the innovation, the skill set, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to execute. Partnering with that, of course, are the nonprofits who may be supporting the surrounding society. Public-private collaboration is not just about contracts or compliance, but it's also about figuring out what's your shared purpose. That's when real transformation can and does actually happen.
In life insurance, there's a concept, lifetime value, where bringing a new insured in costs a lot more money than the amount of premium. And so when you talk to commercial carriers, it's a similar kind of thing. You need to bring them into the concept that they're going to be with us 20 years, and after 5 years, you can ride through that. But it's a concept that isn't easy for commercial businesses to understand. That's a partnership too. Very, very similar. What advice would you give to somebody aspiring to become a leader in government?
There are 3 things, right? So firstly, around leadership in government, you want to make sure that you're leading with purpose. You want to stay grounded in your values, and don't underestimate the power of relationships. Remember why you entered public service in the first place, and that'll help carry you through some of the inevitable challenges that you're going to face. Making sure that you are also investing in relationships. In government, you rarely have full control, and I think this is, in my view, more important in government than perhaps in the private sector. You are frequently leading through influence. You are collaborating with very different parties who frequently have very different agendas than you do. And so building that trust, investing in building that trust and planting those seeds earlier and along the way in your career, I think is absolutely critical. And certainly last but not least, I would say, don't feel that you have to have it all figured out on day one. Absolutely stay open to the unexpected, say yes to the opportunities that stretch you, and know that you can lead from wherever you are. It's not just about position or hierarchy, it's about the impact that you can have.
What wonderful advice, especially in today's world, which is a little topsy-turvy. Who is one person, someone you know personally, or perhaps someone well-known, that's impacted your leadership style?
The leaders that particularly stand out for me are Colin Powell, a woman named Carla Harris, who was a managing director in investment banking, and then last but not least would be my father. Starting with perhaps the more famous one, Colin Powell. I read his biography, loved his perspectives and the rules of leadership that have been particularly influential for me, right? So get mad, then get over it, share the credit, perpetual optimism, a force multiplier, things of that nature. And hearing his story was certainly very inspirational for me. And so I certainly very much look up to him as a role model. The second person that I mentioned is a woman named Carla Harris. She's an African-American woman, became a managing director at an investment bank, in the 80s, at a time when there were not that many women of color in investment banking in New York. And so she's published a book called Her Pearls of Wisdom. It's one of her trademarks. She always wore a pearl necklace, and she has Pearls of Wisdom around how can you be authentic and build relationships to be successful in super challenging environments. And she had a lot of guidance on the importance of finding sponsors and mentors. And certainly last but not least, my father is really my why for I do a lot of the work that I do in the public sector. He started out life like many other, immigrant kids in poverty. He was a strawberry farm laborer. Japanese Americans at the time were not allowed to own the land, so we worked the land. He grew up in that kind of environment. And I just think it's absolutely neat that someone who came really he was dirt poor, to say it, and his daughter ended up working in the White House twice. It's quite the American dream, and I would very much like to have that opportunity available for other people as well.
Well, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Christine, thank you very much for your time today and all of these learnings. It's really good, impactful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.